Hi guys, welcome back to Oldtimer Garage. So for those of you who have been following me lately, you will know that I've been preparing these 2CV for road trips starting in the UK and going all the way down to the south of France. In the last video the car passed its MOT and that was pretty much 1 month before we had to leave the UK. So it left me some time to fix the last details I wanted to do on the car. But most of all I wanted to put as many miles as I could on the car before going to make sure that it was reliable enough to take my wife and my 4-month-old baby pretty much across 2 countries. So the first thing I wanted to do on the car was to fit a tow bar and find a trailer to hook behind it. Not that I needed so many things for this trip, but we were also moving away from the UK, so we sold everything we could and only kept what had real value to us, like our wedding gifts, for example, the baby stuff and my tools. I was lucky enough to find a decently priced trailer not too far from home, and believe me when I tell you that it's hard to come by. When I see the prices the trailers are advertised for, I think I should probably restore trailers rather than cars. Anyway, I went to see the trailer and agreed to come back the next day to pick it up. And so that left me only one evening actually, to fit the tow bar, so I needed some help. And the next evening I was buying the trailer and bringing it home. I will make another video later presenting the whole car and all the add-ups I made to it for this trip, not to mix everything. But basically I had 2 options for this trip. I could cross the channel in Dover or in Portsmouth. I went the Portsmouth route for 3 reasons. The main one being that going by Dover would mean driving around London and then Paris, and knowing how loaded we were going to be, that was something I definitely wanted to avoid. And the second reason was that going by Portsmouth would save me quite a bit of distance, and with a young baby I didn't want to make this trip any longer than necessary. And lastly, by going by Portsmouth I could also drive all the way down to the south of France following the Atlantic coast, which was much more interesting and nice in my opinion than going through the center of France. So in the days that led out to our departure, I started loading the trailer and painted the red rear doors of the car. I could probably have easily let them in red, since I want to completely restore this car, but I thought that it would make it a little bit less noticeable, and I didn't need to get more attention than what I knew I was already going to get. I was a bit worried about how much the trailer was going to push the rear of the car downwards, so when the trailer started to be heavy enough I did a test and hooked it up behind the car to see how much lower the car would sit. But I was pleasantly surprised because it was very little in effect, and actually I couldn't even notice it. So I thought if I kept loading the trailer with the same ratio, it should be okay. The risk being that if I loaded the trailer too much aft of its axle, it would raise the rear of the car, but would be more unstable while driving, and you want to avoid this situation obviously. Now if I load the trailer more to the front of its axle, it would push too much on the rear of the car, and that wouldn't be good either, so a good middle ground between the two has to be kept. Anyway, once the trailer got fully loaded, I waterproofed it with the tarp and waited late in the evening to test drive it and see how it would behave. I wasn't too worried about the car pulling the trailer, but much more about stopping it. And the brakes on the 2CV, despite being disc brakes in the front, are not assisted and not exactly very powerful either. So at that point I didn't have any idea about how the trailer was going to react. I'd estimated that I was just at the weight limit for this kind of trailer, but I didn't have any way of confirming it, so I wanted to make sure there would be as little traffic as possible to take it out for the first time. And actually it behaved very well. I could of course feel that the brakes had to work a little bit harder to stop the car, but it wasn't dangerous either. So with this confirmed, I went back home to tick one more item off my to-do list. So there was only one thing left, and that was loading the car, and actually that was the hardest part. I needed to leave enough space for the baby's car seat, of course, but also think about how to organize everything so that I wouldn't have to take everything out every time I would need something. And actually what was in the car is what lowered the rear part of it the most, and there was not much I could do about it. I thought for a moment to adjust the rear suspensions so that the car would sit higher, but I didn't do it for two reasons. The first one being that I didn't really have time to do it before our departure, and the second one was because I thought by doing so I might strain the springs of the suspensions too much and they might break, which would be even worse obviously. So by the time we were ready to leave, I had already put around 800 miles on the car and nothing bad happened or broke down, so I was a little bit less concerned about how the car would behave during the almost 1,000 mile trip coming up. The way the car and the trailer were going to react to the load was what was concerning me actually, and there was only one way to find out, so it was time to go basically. We finished the handover of the house around noon and left as soon as this was done. Before we had gotten out of the neighborhood, the fog light had already touched the ground and its support broken right off. So I ripped the electric cables off the car and put the fog light inside to be replaced when we arrived. The car was pretty low, as you can see on the pictures, and this was the first proof of it. Our first stop was going to be Portsmouth, and this was the most stressful leg for me because we had a deadline, as we had to board the ferry the day after first thing in the morning, but also because I didn't know how the custom officers were going to react when they were going to see us arriving loaded like that to take the ferry. Again, only one way to find out, so let's go. So we didn't take any motorway during this trip, but the roads in the UK were by far the worst we had to drive in the entire trip. Even the motorways tend to be of average quality in terms of tarmac, but the secondary roads are sometimes just awful, and with the car loaded like mine and trying not to lose my momentum to go up the next hill, it was just impossible to avoid the potholes sometimes. I had to basically quickly assess whether it was better taking the pothole and risking breaking my suspension or swaying around to avoid it and risking tipping the trailer. Anyway, as I said, by far the most stressful of the whole trip, but eventually we made it to Portsmouth and only had to go up a couple of hills in first gear. I strongly advise anyone who wants to undergo a trip into CV loaded like we were to learn and practice in double clutch technique, as this is so very useful to keep your momentum going uphill. It definitely prevented me having to switch to first gear in more than one occasion. If some people are interested, I can make a video about that, so just let me know in the comment. When we arrived at the campsite in Portsmouth, I quickly set up the tent and hooked the trailer, and we went for a quick dinner in town. The car was feeling so fast without the trailer behind. It was really nice to drive it that way after the afternoon I just had. During the whole drive south to Portsmouth, I kept swearing at myself, asking why I always had to undergo stupid projects like this, and then laughing, thinking that I would probably laugh about it in a few days. But I have to admit that I always tend to do these sort of things, and I'm very lucky to have a wife that follows me in all my crazy ideas. She's the best teammate I could ever ask for. The next day I woke up early to fold the tent and check up on the car, making sure everything was still where it should be, and then we left for the port. I wanted to arrive there with plenty of time in case the officers at the custom checks would want to check our load. We were very lucky that they didn't ask us for anything, and in a certain way I think when they saw us coming they just looked away, not wanting to deal with such a load. but I will never know that for sure. What is for sure though is that everybody was looking at us. Some people would come up and knock on my window while we were waiting to embark in the ferry to have a chat, and most of them were just taking pictures. Some were laughing, some much less so, and probably wondering how stupid we had to be to do that. The face some people would put on reminded me a few years ago when I went to buy a couch for our house, and I loaded it in the back of my wife's small convertible in the car park. It was much longer than the car and overhung at the back of it by at least 3 feet, and while I was making sure it was safely loaded, I could overhear a woman walking by telling her husband that it was because of people like me that she was afraid on the road. Oh well, I drove my first car when I was 8 years old, and I've been driving on open roads for about 17 years without ever having had any accident or ticket, so I guess I'm not that bad in the end. Anyway, back to our trip. When arrived the time to embark, we followed all the big cars with trailers and went up the ramp into the belly of the ferry. We had about 6 hours to rest before arriving at Le Havre, and I was fully planning on enjoying this time off. I stayed on the deck watching while we were sailing away from Portsmouth. I couldn't help but think that after 7 years in the UK, I had no idea when was going to be the next time I would be visiting this country again. After that, we had a nice breakfast and then paid to upgrade our tickets to get a cabin. This was the first time in over 3 weeks that we had a proper bed since we had sold all our furniture in the previous months, and the three of us just fell right asleep for pretty much the rest of the crossing. When we got to Le Havre, we got back into the car and drove off the ferry. We had to drive through the immigration checks, and again we got the same looks from all the cars queuing with us. We also had a weird look from a customer officer who was pacing along the queues of cars. I could see him looking longer at our car, and sure enough he came up to my window and started speaking in English to me. I answered in French, and he asked what we were doing with all that. So I told him that we were moving home, and he just sent us on our way. The biggest block I was seeing on this trip was now behind us, and I was relieved and happy to find the French roads. I'm not saying that because I'm French, but the tarmac on the roads in France is so much better than in the UK, it's not even comparable. After a few miles, I stopped to empty a 20-litre jerrycan of petrol I had in the back of the car, and I was planning on not filling it up again before the end of this trip to save some weight of the car. And after that, we were back on the road. I had never driven this road before, so I just set up our destination in the GPS and asked for it to avoid the motorways. This got up to stop in front of a river and wait for the boat to arrive to get us across. Here again, a lot of people walked up to me asking if they could take pictures of the car and chat to us. It's really cool actually to see all these people coming to chat about the cars they used to have on the trips they had done a few years or decades ago. Once on the other side, we just had to drive all the way down to Le Mans, where we had booked another campsite. We called them because we were going to be late getting there, and they said it would be okay, so we just carried on driving. I chose Le Mans at the end of the second leg because it made sense distance-wise, but also because the campsite I found was next to the 24 Hours of Le Mans racetrack, and I was hoping I could see where it was since I'd never been there before. What I didn't know though is that the GPS took us right on the racetrack, and I have to say it's really cool driving for a few miles on this mythical track. When we finally got to the campsite, we found it closed. Nobody was in the offices and the gate was locked. We tried to find a phone number to call or something, but there was nothing. It was already starting to get dark, and we still had to set up the tent. Luckily my wife saw two guys with Renault 4 in the campsite, and I went to ask them if they could unlock the gate for us so that we could put the baby to sleep. Followed that a very cool conversation with them while we were setting up the tent. They had a 1984 and 1985 Renault 4 and were heading south as well. One was from the UK and the other one from the Netherlands. If they watch this video, I owe them a big thank you for having helped us get into the campsite. The next morning we paid the night when the offices opened, and we left our new friends for what was going to be the longest leg of our trip. I wanted initially to leave around 3 o'clock in the morning because I didn't know how long it was going to take us to drive down to Biscarrosse, but also because this was in the middle of the heat wave and I wanted to drive as much as possible while the temperature was still low. That was not possible since we needed to wait until the offices opened to pay for the night. I estimated we had around 9 to 10 hours of driving plus the stops we were going to have to make for the baby. By then I was much more confident in the car, and I was starting to think that it might be able to pull it off all the way to the south. We are very lucky to have an easy baby who just sleeps most of the time while we are driving, and I noticed that she would go for around 3 hours each time before waking up, so we planned our stops accordingly. This part of the trip was really hot and temperatures were nearing 40 degrees. But it was also very nice to just drive through the French countryside. If you wonder why on most pictures the hood is open, this is because to see the engine is air cooled, as you would know. So by opening the hood it cools off better and faster, and with the temperature we were having, I'm pretty sure the engine appreciated very much as much cooling as it could get. Loaded like we were, I could even feel and hear the engine dropping a few RPMs when we were driving through woods or through areas where in the shade where the temperature was a bit lower. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if the car were empty, but loaded like we were, I could definitely hear and feel the difference the denser, cooler air would make on the engine. By 8 or 9 p.m, I can't exactly remember, we're getting to the last campsite of our trip just after we crossed the bridge over the River Garonne, which in my book means that we have entered into the south of France. You will find that there are many north-south borders in France, as there are people you ask the question to, but generally speaking, the further south you go, the further south this border gets. Anyway, we had a nice dinner and walked on the shore of the lake at the campsite, and the next morning we were headed to the Dune of Pilat, which is the highest dune in Europe, I think. I had chosen this campsite on purpose since it was very close to the dune, and because we only had a few hours of driving to our next stop, we had plenty of time to go and walk up to the top of the dune. It was only a short drive from a campsite to the dune, but when we got there, it was already pretty hot. The view from the top of the dune was absolutely worth it though. I don't think it's as nice in the video as it is in reality, so you'll have to go and see for yourself. The next leg of the trip was all the way to pretty much the southwest of France where my grandparents live. It was a very nice short 3-hour drive and I really enjoyed it. The roads were going through the forest of pines that is typical of this area, and it was a pretty easy drive as there are very straight and long roads there. Most often were pretty empty. We only stopped once for the baby and then arrived at my grandparents'. I love the city where I did part of my studies. I wanted to go there to visit my grandparents first, who I'm very close to, and also enjoy a day off to take my wife and daughters to the beach. In my opinion, this is one of the nicest places in France, and probably where I would try and base myself if I ever were to come back to live in France one day. So we enjoyed a well-deserved day off at the beach and with my grandparents before cranking up the engine for the last leg of our trip to my parents. I know this road pretty well for having cycled it once when I was a teenager with my dad, a brother and a sister of mine as a challenge my dad gave us. It was also probably going to be the hardest leg for the 2CV since the UK one, as this leg was going to take us along the Pyrenees mountain. and I knew full well that there were at least 4 areas of this leg that were going to be very steep and challenging for the car. We left off pretty early to take advantage of the freshness before the temperatures got hot, and by the time we got to the first steep slope, the temperature was already getting high. I was pretty pleased though with how the car handled this slope because I only had to drop to second gear when I thought I was going to have to go up the hill in first gear. And again, the same thing happened with the second slope, and by the time we got there, I was already looking at the third one I could see in the distance. This next one wasn't so steep per se, but it was about 6 miles long and getting steeper towards the end. I was hoping to be able to drive most of it in third gear and only drop 1 gear towards the end, but for that I would have to take a blind corner at the bottom of the hill pretty fast not to lose my momentum. I know this road pretty well, so I wasn't worried about that, but sure enough the person driving the car in front of me wasn't so confident and braked right before the corner and all the way into the beginning of the slope. So I came out of the curve with virtually no momentum left and in second gear, and loaded like we were, there was no chance I was going to be able to shift a gear up, so I just resigned myself and let the car work its way up in second gear. By the time we got to the top, I knew it was pretty much won. We were only about 20 miles away from our destination, and even if the car broke down then, it would have been a shame, but it would have been very easy to get someone to come out and help us. To be honest, as we were getting closer, it was getting weirder for me to drive this car on those roads, because I've driven them so many times when I was younger. And in a certain way, I think I was finding it hard to believe that we were going to make it without any problem. There was only one last hill to go up to, and this one, while steep, wasn't very long. The main problem was that there was a big speed bump right at the start of it, so I had to take it in first gear, and after that there was no way to switch up a gear, so we went up most of it in first gear, and then let the car cover quickly the last 3 miles to our destination. I like this picture my mum took right when we arrived. After 900 miles, pretty much to the mile, we made it to where we had planned to, and because I had to have a breakdown, one of the tires of the trailer got punctured right when we arrived, and I'm not lying. But I was very impressed with how the car behaved during this whole trip. For a car that hadn't run for years just a few months ago, saying that it went very well is an understatement. And I'm very happy I didn't do anything to the engine, because I don't think a reconditioned engine could have handled what this one had to, because I wouldn't have had time to run it in properly before leaving, and putting so much weight while running a new engine in is not good at all, obviously. We drove pretty much the whole trip at a speed of between 40 and 50 miles an hour, with even a few moments at 60. The car was low, that's for sure, and I had to go very slow on every single speed bump. And even doing that, the trailer plug got damaged pretty early during the trip, and the tow bar scratched the ground a few times as well, but nothing serious anyway. So, to wrap up this video, I would say that despite the stressful first few miles, this was an awesome trip, and I'm so happy we decided to do it. When we arrived, I unloaded the trailer and the car, and I went for a drive to see the difference. It felt as if the car was happy to at last be able to stretch its leg, and was just flying around the corners of the hilly area of the Pyrenees where my parents live. So the next step now is going to restore this car, but this will have to wait a little, because we're leaving for another trip in just a few weeks, but this time quite far away from France and not by car, so this will probably be for another video. If you are still watching this video by now, thank you very much for having listened to my rambling. I hope you enjoyed this trip as much as we did, and if you ever wonder if those cars are capable of handling a big load and a large trip, then I hope you will know now that this is definitely possible, and most of all very enjoyable. As always, please give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the next video I will present the car in more details and show you what modifications I made to it in preparation for this trip. But for the time being, stay tuned and drive safe.